He followed me online, then offline. A few years ago, I reconnected with an old acquaintance on social media. It all started slow. He'd like things that I posted every now and then, which grew to him liking almost everything over the course of a few months. I took it as a cue that he liked me, but was too shy to make a move. It was cute, but not something that I paid too much attention to. He generally posted cryptic lyrics, and we didn't have much in common. Around the same time, I started to get that cliche feeling that I was being watched. For reference, at the time I lived in a house in the woods. It would be very easy to hide in the bushes. Our lawnmower wasn't the best, but it worked. You could adjust the height of the grass, and somehow that mechanism broke while my brother was out mowing the lawn, so we ended up with some weird patches of bald grass. No big deal. Later that night, though, I saw a post from that old acquaintance about patterns in the grass. It seemed like a song lyric, but I couldn't find a song that matched up to it. I didn't think anything of it until I was outside the next day and realized our lawn had some strange patterns after that mishap. I, being a big old paranoid weirdo, got a bit freaked out. I tried to calm myself down. It was probably nothing, right? Plus, what could I even do? It proved nothing. A few nights later, I had that same creepy feeling, so I went out on our porch. It's large. There's no easy way to sneak up. We're partially earth berm, so it runs along the second story and the edge is mostly in the air and fenced. So I felt safe. I waited, listening for anything. Then I just sort of started yelling, like he was there. I said that I thought he was really creepy. I talked about all the terrible things I would do to him if he ever made the mistake of coming near me, and I went back inside. I know it sounds dumb, but then he unfollowed me from all social media, stopped liking everything I posted, and left me alone. And when I went to his profile, he deleted that song lyric about the patterns in the grass. Maybe it was all completely coincidental. That's what I like to believe. Maybe he finally got sick of my ramblings and that just happened to coincide with my speech. Or maybe he was out there in the woods watching and listening. Followed home by a real bad guy. I just moved into a new flat with some friends for university. At this point, we didn't know the area well, and we're still getting our feet on the ground. We had a large chain supermarket a few blocks from us, and none of us had a car, so that's normally where we go for shopping, because it was in walking distance. The supermarket had a foyer with some benches, so normally, whoever finished shopping first would wait for the others there. On this day, however, my flatmate Kate finished shopping before the rest of us, so she went to wait out the front. It was late evening and the store was winding up, so she was basically alone in the foyer. She'd buried herself in her phone when a man sat down next to her on the bench much closer than was comfortable. Now we live in a small city in a small country where there isn't a lot of racial diversity, so it's worth mentioning that this guy was black. She later told me that it was the first time she'd ever met an African person. There really just aren't many of them in our country, I guess, let alone our city. He was wearing a completely black suit that didn't fit him, and he smelled overpoweringly of cologne and cigarettes. Kate told me he smelled like he hadn't washed in a while, too. According to her, there was a fairly long pause after he sat down, and the conversation went along something like this. Hello. Hi. You have beautiful hair. Thanks. What is your name? Louise, yours? I am from Somalia. Brief pause. Where do you live? It was at this point I finished and came out to meet her. I could immediately tell how tense and uncomfortable she was. As soon as she saw me, she jumped up. I can still remember his face. While he was talking to her, he had this creepy kind of fixed grin, all teeth and roaming eyes, but they were all over her. As soon as he saw me, the smile was gone, replaced by a completely blank expression. He got off the bench almost before she did, and turned and walked towards the store entrance, as if he was trying to pretend I couldn't see him that way. On the way home, she told me how creeped out she was, and how she'd probably take her motor scooter to a different store in the future. I thought she was just overreacting, but she should do whatever makes her feel safest. She was only 18 years old and pretty sheltered. This kind of thing had never happened to her before. A few hours after we get home, I'm just about to go to bed. While I'm brushing my teeth, I hear someone knock at the door. We hadn't been living there long, and we literally never had anyone come to the door like that, let alone near midnight. I was immediately on edge. As I opened the door just a crack, I put my full weight against the frame to stop it getting forced open. There on the doorstep was the guy from the supermarkets. He had this creepy fake smile on again. "Can Louise come out?" At first, I couldn't really understand his accents, but I worked him out after a few seconds. "Nobody with that name lives here." I didn't know Kate had been smart enough to give him a false name, but it didn't matter. When I said that, he dropped the smile, but didn't walk away. Instead, "Can I have your phone?" "No." "Can I borrow your cigarettes?" "No, goodbye." At this point, I closed the door. I watched through our quick kitchen window as he wandered slowly down our driveway and onto the dark streets. He didn't look back, but instead, he pulled out his own cell phone and started making a phone call. He must have followed us home. There was no other way he would have known where we lived. The fact he knew I smoked at the time meant he watched me come out of the house at some point during the evening. I hadn't had a smoke on the walk home, and I cooked dinner as soon as I got back. I only went out for a smoke after I'd eaten, which was probably an hour and a half after we got back. Had he been out there somewhere in the bushes, watching that whole time? And if he had his own phone, why the hell did he need mine? I told Kate, and made sure to keep all our doors and windows locked. I was shaken up enough I didn't sleep much at all that night. But by the next day I calmed down and put it out of my mind. A few days later in the early afternoon, while I was biking to work, I saw him walking near our house. He was wearing the same exact clothes as before, on the phone and smoking a cigarette. Almost as soon as I got to work, I got a call from one of my other flatmates. The guy had knocked on the door again, once again asking for Louise. I told him the story quickly before I clocked in for my shift, and he promised to keep an eye on things during the evening. That was the last I heard of our odd visitor for months. Eventually I learned our neighbors over the road were refugees from Somalia, and one afternoon I introduced myself to them and started chatting about neighborly stuff. They were a house of 4 middle-aged single mothers, all with young kids and absent fathers who had either been killed in conflict or had been denied refugee status. Somalia really doesn't sound like a great place to live, put it that way. It turns out my town has a very small but close-knit community of Somalians, only about 150 people, almost all of them refugees. In case you don't know, their culture values sharing as a community value. If you need something, you can ask for it, and your neighbor will usually give it to you. Something like sharing a cell phone around the community is pretty normal. Obviously that doesn't work here, but that's where he had come from. The more I talked and learned, the more it kind of made sense why this guy was acting the way he did. He was a fish out of water, didn't understand his behavior was a bit creepy in his new home country, and was just trying to be friendly. I honestly started to feel bad about judging him so harshly, even if he did make my friend uncomfortable. One of the times I was talking to neighbor ladies, I asked if they knew who he was. At first they were confused and weren't sure who I was talking about, but as I started describing him, they went from my friendly, laughing neighbors to deadly serious. They started asking questions about him. When was he here? What did he want? Who was he on the phone with? Suddenly I was the one getting grilled. Eventually they started explaining what they knew. They knew of him, but didn't know him personally. According to them, they thought he had been involved in human trafficking back in Somalia. In fact, the exact word they used was slavery. They didn't explain much, but I understood from what they said that the human trafficking generally involves young, beautiful girls, a lot like my flatmate Kate. They wouldn't tell me his name, and they didn't know what he did for a living now that he was here. They told me since he had been in our country, he's been in constant trouble with the police for following young women, even though he was apparently married to someone back in Somalia. They found that the most dishonorable thing about him, even though he'd been arrested a few times for theft, they really didn't like him, because they felt people like him gave their community a bad name. A year or two went by after this, and by total chance, I saw a short article in the newspaper. The headline was something like, "Refugee convicted of sexual assault." His name was suppressed, but the article revealed he was Somalian. A couple months after I last seen him, he'd forced his way into another student flat by following some girls home from class. He waited a few hours until one of them was at home, then barged through the door when she answered it and assaulted her. He'd also stolen her cell phone and laptop afterwards. That kind of thing almost never happens in our city, and the similarities between what happened there and what happened to us made me certain it was the same guy. I never found out what happened to him after that, but I hope he's still in prison. I really don't think less of the local Somalian community because of him, though. The ladies I was friends with were some of the nicest and friendliest people I've ever met. The hardships they've gone through aren't something anyone should have to experience, and for them to come out smiling and positive takes a strength I don't think I could ever possess. But the creepy, tall, skinny dude who followed me and my friend home that night, yeah, let's not meet. They followed me for miles. Apologies if this isn't the right format, but here goes. This happened about 3 years ago, but is still one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me. For some background information, I live in a city of just over 100,000 people. Not huge, but it has a lot of suburbs on the edge of town. I live near downtown, but my friend lived right in the middle of one of these suburbs. I was leaving her house at around 11:30 at night, and while I can't remember what day of the week it was, I remember not being terribly worried about running into anyone. From her house to mine was around 8 miles, and I was driving an e-bike, which is kind of like an electric moped that can only go about 20 miles per hour. Since the speed limit was usually 25 to 30 in the city, I was used to cars speeding around me. It was no big deal. Anyways, I leave her place and start driving home. The first half of the trip is uneventful, but as you get closer to downtown, the neighborhood itself gets rougher. Right around the halfway point, I'm parked at an intersection when I noticed a kind of beat up red Sunfire behind me. I thought it was a bit weird that they didn't pull up beside me, since cars at intersections usually did. I kept to the right side like any other cyclist would, but e-bikes were pretty new in my town at that point, so I figured they just didn't know how much space to give me. The light changes, I drive on, and it takes me another 2 blocks to realize the car is not passing me. This is where I realized things were weird. The car was trailing behind me at only 20 to 30 feet and was coasting at 20 miles per hour, despite the fact that there were no other cars anywhere on the road, so overtaking me would be easy. It was weirding me out, but I figured they would get bored and move on eventually. A couple miles later, I started heading into downtown, and sure enough, the car was still following me. I could only see them in my mirrors, but I could tell that there were at least 2 people in the car, so I was outnumbered too. I started to get worried as I got closer to home, realizing that I'm going to have to stop eventually, and wondering what will happen when I do. My house, despite being near downtown, was on a quiet street that barely got any traffic, and wasn't very well lit. As I'm approaching a yellow light, I decide to risk running it to leave them behind at the red lights. I turn left, only to be greeted by another red light. Thinking quick, I turn right on the red, but I can hear the squealing tires as the first light turns green, and the car circles around the block the way I didn't go, to meet up with me. At this point, I'm facing the car on a side street, dead on. I have 2 choices: drive towards the car or turn left. The car is not moving, instead of waiting for me to make a decision. I turn left, as it is the way towards my house, and the car calmly turns to follow behind me. At this point, I'm losing it, even though it's cold, and I'm shaking like mad. I take out my cell phone and call my boyfriend. I know I should have called the police, but I was freaking out. I tell him he had better get his ass outside of our place right now, because there's no way I am stopping alone. At the same time, I'm describing the make and model of the car as best as I can while trying not to crash. When the people in the car realize I am on the phone, they decide to overtake me. As they do, I look over and see 2 men, rough looking, probably in their 30s. They're laughing their heads off, not in a what a fun joke, but in a cruel way, like they're going to get me no matter what. It was absolutely terrifying. I figured that they thought I was calling the cops, so I start to calm down. They're still going pretty slow ahead of me, but at least they aren't following me anymore. As I'm coming up to the street I live on, I make sure to wait until they're past the intersection before I put on my right blinker, and they put on theirs. I turn onto my street as their tires squeal again, turning onto the street one block up. I know that they go faster than me, and I contemplate trying to find somewhere to hide. I decide against it, and sure enough, as I come up to the first intersection, their car is sitting perpendicular to me, waiting for me to pass by so they can follow again. It seemed like it was some kind of hilarious, cruel game to them, watching me try to get away and knowing they could always go faster. As we approached my house, I saw my boyfriend standing on the lawn, arms crossed and leering at the car. He wasn't good for much, but I'm glad as hell he was there. I pulled into the driveway, and as the car was halfway into the driveway as well, they finally saw him. They were gone before I could even turn my bike off. So, creepy, nasty men who decide I'd be their fun game for the night. Let's not meet. Followed home last night and realized this man has been watching me for a while now. I was out of town yesterday with a friend and ended up getting in much later than usual. I was sunburned and tired, so I guess I wasn't paying as much attention as I normally do, and I had my music playing very loudly in my headphones. It was around 10 p.m. at night, and I got off my train and took my regular walk home. Nothing too poorly lit, but all of a sudden I saw a shadow of someone walking very slowly, right behind me. Possibly just someone wanting to pass me. So, I instantly turned down my music to silent and slowed down my walk drastically. A man ducked around me and passed by. He walked in front of me for a bit, and I thought maybe I was just paranoid, but he slowed down and started walking very, very slowly, looking over his shoulder every few steps to see where I was. I stopped and let him just walk for a bit, and when he was over a block away, I started walking again. Then I watched him duck into a park and hide behind the swing set, straight staring at me. So I crossed the street and beeline towards a better lit street and turned to call a friend, no pickup. Called another, no pickup. Up ahead, I can hear a loud party raging at the church up ahead, and aim for that. I turn around and he's right behind me again. So I walk out into the middle of the well-lit street and just stand under a streetlight, shining my flashlight app on him as he walked by. He repeated the looking back and walking slowly behavior until I made it to the church. I stood out front and leaned against the car waiting for him to go. He turned into an alley that goes behind the houses on my street. He literally stood behind the bush, right up against the wall, and stared at me. I stared right back, until he ducked into the alley fully out of my sight. Around then, wedding guests came out and started talking to me, and shortly after, my friend actually called me back. She talked to me until I got home, as I narrated where I am, gave her a description of the guy in case anything at all happened, and I got in all right. However, when I saw him duck into that alley, I realized that I had seen him before. Dozens of times. I see him regularly on my walks home from work. I often see him walking near me, shortly ahead of, or shortly behind me. I see him duck into that alley, and often see him pop out into his property as I walk by on the main street, since the shortcut saves no time. But it's always daytime, and he's never really jumped out at me before last night, as the walk is always a busy one after work hours. This man definitely knows where I live. He knows my work schedule, and he knows my habits as well. He may have been watching me for weeks on end, to months now, and I only registered him just last night. Luckily though, I'm moving very soon, and it's time to change my transit habits and never go out at night again, without anyone knowing where I am until then. So, any other tips of what to change up that I have to do, or whatever I have to do to stop this guy from stalking me like this? Anything, any comments, please leave it below, and I will reply. I'll try my best to do so. Thank you guys so much. Any tips, or what to change up at all, are highly welcomed. Thanks for reading.